This show is listener supported. You can join us and help our show grow to support more adoptees by going to adopteeson.com/partner. You're listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is episode 118, Liz DeBetta. I'm your host, Haley Radke. Hey friend, I'm so glad to be back bringing you brand new episodes every single Friday. Earlier this year, I met Liz DeBetta at a conference where she was presenting a session called Expressing the Primal Wound, Poetry as Healing. I knew instantly I had to have her on the show because we need to hear all about this. Today, Liz shares about the shift her life took in her late 30s as she started to examine her adoption more closely. We talk about how Liz believes we can reveal who we truly are through writing, and how building our own narrative instead of accepting the ones that are placed on us can bring about tremendous growth. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Liz DeBetta. Welcome, Liz.
Hi, Haley.
I'm so glad to talk to you again. We have met in person in Washington, D.C. earlier this year, and you saw me at a very rough point in that weekend, which let's not get into that. But, aren't you always closer friends with someone who you've seen crying and wiping your face?
Yep, that was a lot. But
and yet here you are willing to talk to me. Okay, that feels good.
Because I never cry.
Oh, well, that's good. It's good for you to see someone else be emotional.
Just kidding.
Well, why don't you start out the way we always do, and would you share some of your story with us?
Sure. So let's see. I guess I'll start at the beginning-ish.
You did air quotes for the people that aren't able to see you.
Yeah. Because, adoption, beginnings, ambiguity. But what I do know is, so I was adopted in 1977, closed adoption in the state of New Jersey. And I recently found out, because I've been going back through my non-identifying information, that I've got about almost the first 9 months of my life that are sort of a mystery. I know that I was in some kind of foster care, but I don't really know too much about that. So that's been something lately that's been a curiosity for me and sort of weighing on my mind in terms of maybe that's the next piece of the puzzle that I need to start to figure out. But I grew up in Staten Island, New York, and for most of my life, my parents were really open about the fact that I was adopted. It was never really a secret. It was kind of just that was our family. And then because of closed adoption, after a while, it sort of became a non-issue. It was just not a thing that we talked about anymore, simply because if I did have questions, there were no answers. And so I think, I just sort of didn't have any more questions because I knew that there was nothing else that I could know other than what, little bit they told me. And, that sort of brief entrance narrative, which is this idea that my birth mom was really young and that she was in a relationship with somebody that she was unsure of, and they knew that they wanted to be married in order to have a family, and they weren't sure that's where they were going. So instead they decided, that it would be better for me to be given up to adoption, and that they wanted me to go to a Catholic family, to people with college degrees. And so that's sort of the story that I grew up with. And there's a lot embedded in that. And we'll probably get into that a little bit later when we talk about some of the current work that I'm doing. But so that's really loaded, that little brief, tiny story, right? So that's the thing that I sort of had my whole life about, where I came from, all that jazz. And so like most of us, I think for a long time, I didn't, everything was fine. Like I was just being a kid and, doing things and, being a teenager and doing things. And I think that I spent a lot of time when I was growing up just being really good in school and just sort of being an overachiever in school and like getting good grades and like getting awards and scholarships and all that stuff that I now know why. And it wasn't until my late 30s that I started to really, I had patterns of depression throughout my teens and 20s. And, at a couple of points kind of thought it might be connected to the fact that I was adopted. And, at one point, that's when I got my non-identifying information. But, like most of us who have requested that, we could probably all agree that it really is what it says it is. And there's not a whole lot to go on. And so like even having that information, especially like in the, I don't know, mid 1990s, when the internet was like mid to late 1990s, when the internet was like infant stages, like what could you do with it? So I kind of put it away and didn't really think about it for a long time and like just tried to live life normally, more air quotes for you. um, and then at some point, like in my late 30s, like I had gone through a divorce and lots of other stuff. And I started to notice some really bad patterns in terms of the kinds of relationships that I was choosing, or that I was constantly finding myself in. And I sort of hit a wall and was like, okay, I need to do something about this. Like I need to take a step back and like figure some out. I need to really like understand what's going on, because obviously I'm not going to move forward if I continue to do these kinds of things and these patterns repeat and I continue to make these kinds of choices. So yeah, so at that point I chose to leave another really unhealthy relationship. And that was a really emotional thing for me, because leaving, separation anxiety, even though I knew it was a good choice, like still felt like a death. I mean, like you talked about getting emotional earlier, like I totally hear that, because every time, even if I was the one to leave the relationship, it was like the world was coming to an end. Like somebody died, like all this grief and all this stuff was coming up. So I started thinking about that and those reactions. I started thinking about the unhealthy patterns in these sort of significant relationships that I was trying to have. And I coincidentally started taking a writing class at the time about memoir and personal narrative. And the final project for that class was to write a memoir-based personal narrative about a significant life experience. And the whole, like for weeks, I was like, what the hell am I going to write about? I don't want to write about my divorce. I don't want to write about, like my bad breakups. Like what? And then all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, I'm adopted. Maybe I should write about that. And so that opportunity to try to write the story as I knew it then was the catalyst for a lot of growth and change that I'm still going through, because it gave me an opportunity to start to figure out what that story was and what was missing from my story and what maybe I needed to know, and started to give me a place to think about figuring out how to heal myself. And so also at that same time, I started reading and researching about adoption, and I had all the titles of the books, like The Primal Wound and Journey of the Adopted Self and all the, the ones that we all get recommended to read. But I had never, until I wrote this personal narrative, I had never really thought about why reading those books might be important. And so the first thing I read was The Primal Wound. And I was like, oh my God, I am not crazy. This is totally my life. And so many things like just came clicking into place. And I thought, oh, okay. I now start to have some explanations for some of these things. And then I started to read more and think more about my own life and experiences, and started to, come out of the fog and really acknowledge that, like, okay, even though I've had a really good life and like my family's awesome and my parents are amazing, that like I've got a lot of underlying issues, and I've got to do some work to address them. And so that's been sort of ongoing in lots of ways for the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. And then in the beginning of 2017, New Jersey changed the laws and allowed for partial access to records. So, and I found out about that quite by accident.
Can you explain what that means? What does partial access to the records in New Jersey mean?
Sure. So I'm hope that I can get all the numbers right at this moment in time. But like of all the 52 states, there are currently only 9 or about to be 10 once Governor Cuomo in New York signs the bill, who allow full unrestricted access to adoptee birth records, which means that in those states you can get anything connected to your birth, including your original birth certificate, any of the paperwork from initial counseling sessions, anything that went through social services or whatever the agency was, anything that might have been filed with the court. States that allow, partial or restricted access, it's limited what you can get, and that varies state by state. So, to my understanding, in New Jersey, it means that if the birth family or birth parents have not requested a redaction of any of the records, then you can get access to whatever has not been redacted. So I was able to get a copy of my original birth certificate. I sent away for it, and ironically, it arrived on my 40th birthday.
Happy birthday.
Right? I was like, oh, this is weird. Thanks, universe. So then I knew who my birth mom was. Took me 40 years,
Was just her name on the OBC?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just her name. And all of a sudden I had a name, like it wasn't just this like nebulous idea of a person that I had always carried around with me. It was like, oh, she's a real person and she exists. And I knew that because I stalked her on Facebook, like we all do. And, it was pretty easy. It was pretty easy to find her once I had her name, and could piece together sort of locations and stuff like that. And so a couple weeks after that, I reached out to her and, sent her a little note on Facebook just to say, hey, sure you're not expecting this, but guess what? And she was overjoyed to hear from me. And she told me that she had been waiting for this for 40 years and that she was really glad to hear from me and that she was really glad to know that I had had a good life and that she wanted to, get to know me and that she would tell me anything that I needed to know, as much as I could handle in terms of, all the backstories. And so, I couldn't have hoped for a better outcome, but I do have to say that intuitively, I knew that would be the case. And I cannot explain why I knew that, but I have always had this very deep conviction for most of my life that if and when I was able to reach out and find her, that she would want to know me and that it would all be good. So, yeah, so we've been in reunion now. Her name is Mary. She still lives in the same area of New Jersey that she did when I was born. And when she got divorced, she purposefully went back to her maiden name so that if and when I tried to find her, it would be easier for me.
And so how long have you been in reunion?
That's about 2.5 years. Yeah, it'll be coming up on 3 years, like in March of 2020. So, yeah.
So when we were in DC, you were also a little bit there was stuff happening and things. And I was like, what's going on for you? And you're like, I'm meeting my sister for the very first time tonight.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you have siblings as well.
Yeah. I have three half siblings, all of whom are younger. My half sister Pam, who I got to meet while we were in DC, is really great. She's just like a little over a year younger than I am, so we're really close in age, and really, really similar, sort of personalities and worldviews, which is really interesting. In fact, we ordered the same meal at dinner, not having discussed what we were thinking about eating. So that was kind of funny. Yeah, and it was great to connect with her and to have a sister, because I grew up with brothers, and I have two half brothers as well. I haven't met them yet, but I know that they are interested in getting to know me. It just has been challenging because we live on opposite sides of the country at the moment.
So you've got all this reunion stuff going on, and you've been diving into adoption stuff since your late 30s, and you're taking writing classes and things. Tell us about your professional side during this time period.
Okay, so lots of shifts and changes in that arena too, because at the time this whole journey started, I was working for an amazing nonprofit in New York City called Pajama Program, which is a nonprofit that provides new books and new pajamas to kids in need. A lot of kids that are in foster care, some of whom are awaiting adoption, kids who are in homeless shelters, who don't, a lot of kids who have been removed from their homes and put into shelters awaiting foster care placement and things like that. And so while I was there, I had a wonderful boss and mentor and friend named Jen Paturo, who really reminded me about the power, how the power of stories and nurturing and being a genuine self, and reaching out to other people. And so that sort of gave me an opportunity to start thinking about my own experience, right? And some of the privilege that I've had that a lot of these kids didn't get to have or won't get to have. And then so I took that writing course and I started to think about, years ago I was a teacher, and I started to think about what the next stage in my life was. And I felt like I had done a lot of really good work with Jen and with Pajama Program. And I built a free literacy support program for preschool through high school kids, and just, gave kids the ability to share stories and to write about their grief in some of those programs. And then I thought, okay, what's next? And I decided I wanted to go back to teaching. So my partner and I moved from New York City to Utah, strangely enough, because he got a tenure track job at Utah Valley University. And I thought, okay, it's my time to go back to teaching. And I was really interested in teaching higher ed because I'm really interested in writing and stories and the power of personal stories. And so I started teaching at the same university. And I've been teaching there for the last 3 years. This is my 4th year teaching. And I teach writing, but I also decided a couple of years ago around that same time that because I love teaching so much that I would pursue a PhD. So I have been teaching and being a student and working on my PhD through Union Institute and University. And what I loved about that program was that the foundations of the program are creativity, social justice, and ethical and creative leadership. And when I started the program, I wasn't really sure how I was going to combine my background. And my background is my undergraduate degree is in theater, and I spent a lot of time working as a professional actor. So I have this background in performance. I have this background as a teacher and a writer. And I thought, how can I sort of smash these things together? And when I found the program at Union, it's an interdisciplinary program in humanities that really allowed me to kind of forge my own path. And what ended up happening was through so much of the personal writing that I do was that I started doing all this research, continuing to research about adoption related issues, and started using my own experience to ground the research that I was doing. So I am almost done. I will be ABD, which is all but dissertation, and within the next couple of months. I have to say that because some people are like, "Huh, what?"
I wouldn't know.
Yes, I take for granted that people know because I spend so much time around academics these days that if I say that, most of them are like, "Cool, that's awesome." But then there's other people that are like, "Can I have a
Just
translation?"
the normals need the translation.
Yeah, so I've been combining, my love of poetry and personal narrative and using personal stories as a way to get into larger social and cultural issues. And it's been I couldn't have said, 3 years ago when I started this journey that so much of my work would revolve around adoption stuff, but it's become really important for me and for other people.
One of the things that you said in your presentation at the conference you and I both presented at, you said, we can reveal who we are through writing. Now, what does that mean for you with regards to your adoption story?
Okay, so it's important to know that I actually started writing poetry when I was about 14 years old. And at the time, I just wrote in my little journals, like if I was feeling things, I just wrote these poems and I don't know where they came from. But I had a teacher that said to me, maybe you should think about writing poetry. And I was like, that's dumb. Because at 14, you think you know everything. But, I actually realized it wasn't such a bad idea. And so I still have all of those books of poetry, right? So what I've come to learn now at this point in my life, 20 some odd years later, almost 30 years later, is that especially like as an adopted person, like, and I think, many people, because many people in the world have been traumatized in various ways for various reasons. And writing can be a way to come to know yourself. For me, like I was able to look back through all of that older poetry and see very clearly the themes of grief, loss, confusion, and all of that, the underlying kind of pain and sadness that came through in those words that, came out of my, 14, 15, 16, 18, 20-year-old self. And so I have a really clear map from all of those years of writing that tells me, okay, this was my way of dealing with the trauma that I didn't know I had yet. And so now in the work that I do, in terms of narrative theory, right? Like narrative theory says that when we give something a structure, when we create a story about some difficult event in our lives, we can organize what has formerly felt chaotic or overwhelming. And so particularly as it relates to the presentation I did at AAC last spring, I think it's really important for adopted people to have the ability to write themselves instead of taking the stories that have been told to us, that have been imposed upon us, which I see those stories like the entrance narrative I mentioned at the beginning of this chat. Like I see those kinds of stories that like society gives us and that our parents might give us, or adoptive parents might give us as oppressions. And the way to break free from those oppressions is to give yourself agency and empower yourself by writing your own story.
That's so good. I'm just like, okay, the stories that other people are telling about our story is an oppressive thing, and it's empowering to write our own story.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's really powerful.
Yeah. And I think that's why we're seeing so many adoptees, publishing memoirs and publishing in the popular media at least parts of their stories. So just this morning, I read this great article in Catapult magazine by Troy Hines who is another adult adoptee, writing about his experience as a, being adopted as a Black child by two white lesbian moms. And so totally different circumstances than mine. But this idea that, I just mentioned like that some of the stories that are given to us, right, these narratives that are oppressive, that come from the external world in terms of like, and we've all heard it, you're so lucky, right? You should feel grateful. You're so lucky. And his article is another example of the ways that I'm seeing more adoptees being willing to put their voices out in the public and start to decenter some of the what, like what I said, what I term are these narratives of oppression.
I know you're working on your PhD with other people that are studying different things than you. When you talk about adoption with them in this way and in trying to change the narrative, what have been some of the responses, and what have you explained that's been helpful and that they have understood to kind of shift the narrative?
I'm always like a little humbled and surprised, but also like really pleased when people come back to me and say, "I'm learning so much from you." And several of my professors, including Diane, who's my dissertation chair, have said to me, like, "I had no idea about these aspects of adoption. And because of your work, I have learned so much more about the ways that trauma, is present, and the ways that, both adoptees and birth mothers and first families have been marginalized in favor of power differentials that exist in adoption culture." And so, yeah, so I think that just in a lot of it has been in reading various papers and the ways that I've been exploring adoption in different ways, and like papers and essays that I've written for different classes, and also in my creative writing, and my classmates too. I mean, so many of my classmates, one of my cohort members, Linda, has a niece and a nephew who are adopted, and she never really thought about the adoption as something that could be problematic for them. And because she has read some of my work and some of my creative writing and has witnessed some of my performance work around that, she's always sending me little messages like, "Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to realize that these kids might be struggling, and I need to have, like my family and I should have more empathy and be more aware of the supports that they need," particularly in terms of like therapy. A lot of people don't realize the lack of competency with regard to adoption issues that exists in the therapy world. And so that's some of the other ways that I think people are learning from my work. And, and just, I think, and a lot of it is centered in my own story. And I feel it's really important to keep telling my story so that people can get the picture, and that's a way to open people's minds to, oh, okay, wait a minute, it's not the thing that I see in the movies. Okay. Like, because this is a real person, and I know this real person, and these are the things that she has been through. So I've opened up a lot of people's minds.
Huh. It sounds like you're telling the hard things, which a lot of us, I don't want to speak for all adoptees, but I do think a lot of us hide the hard parts. And it's so easy to go along with, oh, of course, that's a happy adoption story. Like that's just easier to kind of gloss over. Even when I was coming home from dropping my kid off to school, and one of my friends who knows about my podcast, she says to me, she's like, "Oh, have a good interview." And another brand new mom who I don't know, she's like, "Oh, are you going for a job interview?" And I was like, "No, I interview people for my job." "Oh, well, what do you do?" I'm just like, "Oh, I don't really want to get into it because I don't know your stance on adoption, and it's challenging, and it feels so personal and vulnerable just to say I'm adopted and I do this thing where I talk to other adopted people. And that's like nothing compared to processing your pain and trauma that's affected your life and had a big impact on it. And I mean, it's like standing out there naked. I don't know. It's a whole big thing. So anyway, good for you for actually sharing that really hard stuff and with colleagues too. I mean, that must feel like a stretch for you. Is it?
I don't, I think that that's one of the things that has been really beautiful about my choosing this particular PhD program at Union is that it is really a space. The human beings that teach in that program, that administer the program, and then the students that come from all over the United States and internationally are an exceptional group of really expansive humans that are interested in whatever individual journeys we're on as people and as scholars. And I have found a beautiful community of colleagues that have been 150% supportive of this work. They acknowledge how challenging it is. They don't know because they're not the ones doing it, but they're supportive. They acknowledge that this must be difficult, but they are also sort of on my team, and they're like, this is such important work, and you need to keep doing it. And so I feel like I as hard as it is, I think that's where my experience as a theater professional and as an actor has really come in handy, is because that's a vulnerability. Rosalind Russell said acting is getting up on stage and turning around naked very slowly. Something along those lines, right? And so you
already know how to do that.
You just almost said the same thing, right?
Yep,
so
yep.
I mean, but yes, it's a little bit different in that now I'm like really exposing myself because I'm like, nah, this is my like total truth. And but like, I think that, like what your beautiful keynote at AAC and talking about asking us to tell the hard parts, right? Like we have to, and it's a lot of emotional labor, and it's not, so I have to do the work for me and for us so that those other people out there can't turn away from it. And so that's why I choose to also to do so much performance-based work.
Do you think there has been a shift in openness towards actually listening to adopted people over the last few years? Have you noticed that at all?
I want to say yes. And I think that the yes comes in that there are more of us that are all grown up now and coming into our truths and ourselves and going, okay, we're not going to hide from this anymore. And we have the tools and the capacity, and in many cases, the privilege to start speaking out. And so I think for that reason, because I'm seeing the voices multiplying over time, that people can't help but listen. But I also know that there are still so many people on the other side of it that don't want to listen, that consistently shut us down, and because of our digital media culture, it's so easy to do that online, right? Like, there's a couple of, and I don't want to like throw anybody under the bus, but there's a couple of, there's another podcast that's done by some adoptive parents, and they have a blog and a website, and they consistently block and delete comments by adult adoptees who are not being nasty, who are not being, defensive in any way, who are just saying like, hey, listen, you know what, where are the adults that your kids are going to grow into? And you might want to listen. You might want to learn from our experiences, and they don't want to, and so when we talk about like all these oppressions, right, and like narratives of oppression, well, This is another example of that. So I hope that as more of us continue to be, outspoken and share our stories and not turn away from the hard stuff, that things will start to shift even more.
Thank you for those thoughts. Okay, as we're starting to wrap up and we're going to do our recommended resources right away, do you have any last thoughts or advice for adopted people who are really looking for healing and writing is something that's interesting to them? Any thoughts on how or where to start? What's the most beneficial way in? Sometimes it kind of feels scary if you're like, yeah, just sit down and write about your own story. Like maybe that's a little too scary to kind of just start with that. Do you have thoughts or advice for them?
I tend to not like to place a lot of rules around writing for both myself and my students, and anybody that I work with. I think it's useful to, like, if you're reading other adoptees' stories, right? If you're reading some of the stuff that's been, like, even, just as the example we use of Troy Hines, right? If you read his article, maybe there's something in there, that speaks to you, that you can take a line from there that resonates with your own experience and use that as the jumping off point. I'm always a fan of taking a line from something else and then using that as the catalyst for your own way into expressive writing. Sometimes it can just be a list of words, right? Like, I think, I feel, I am is a really good way to start, and starting to think about, like, what I think, what do I think about myself? How do I feel? Who am I today? And a lot of times, like, what comes out of that tend to be, at least for adopted people, what I've seen in the work that I've done, is that, like, there are lots of common themes that emerge when you start to take some basic prompts.
I think I could see that. That doesn't sound too scary. That sounds totally doable. And for someone who has never written before, and if they're going to sit down with a prompt, like, what are they going to do? Like 5 minutes, 10 minutes? What's like the beginner, basic level starting point?
I would say probably like 5 minutes is good. But, if you've never written before and the idea of writing is totally scary, which it is for a lot of people, because it's another form of vulnerability, right? You're like committing something to paper. Another idea too is like to write letters, like, write a letter to, like, this is a prompt that I've used in some workshops. Write a letter to the little girl, a little boy, a little person inside of you, right? That inner person that most of us are still working to integrate and heal, right? So what would you say to that little person? Write a letter. You can write a letter to, like, any part of your adopted life, right? Write a letter to your trauma, and you don't, these are things that, obviously, like, are for you. They don't ever have to be shared. But in the act of, there's actually research that supports that in the act of actually committing something to paper and getting the words out, you are creating space for healing yourself, both psychologically and physically. They've done some studies where people that write about traumatic experiences, kind of specifically, even if they don't share it with anyone, they've just put it on paper, they have better mental and physical health outcomes. So
That's so neat. And what did you call that before, with the narrative theory? Is that right?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And say that one more time for us. What that is.
So that's basically when we give our experiences a structure, like a story, that we give it a narrative form. Maybe there's a beginning and a middle and an end. Typically, that's how narratives work, right? We create a structure for it. I like to call it a container, that we create a container for whatever those overwhelming or chaotic feelings are. And we put them in a structure or a container, which is a story or a poem, because a poem can be a narrative too. And then that helps us to make sense out of those experiences. It helps us to reorganize those feelings in a way that feels less scary, that feels less overwhelming.
Thank you. That is so helpful. I love thinking about that. It's such a helpful framework just to think about writing in that fashion, especially if you're trying to approach it from a a place of looking for healing, doing that
Mhm.
kind of work. Thank you so much, Liz. Let's go and do ahead and do our recommended resources. I'm going to let you go first since yours is on theme with everything we've talked about today.
Yeah. So the thing that I would, based on the conversation we've had, the thing that I would recommend, there's an article by Viv Grant, who is an adult adoptee in the UK. And she wrote an essay called Adoption, Love, and the Struggle to be Born. And the reason I like it is because it's one of the only other things I've come across in my research that is closely related to the kind of work that I am doing and I'm interested in continuing to do. And she uses the method of autoethnography by writing her narrative. So autoethnography is just a real fancy way of saying I'm going to use myself to explore larger social and cultural issues. And so she does that through poetry, and she comes at it because she has this idea that the writing of her story will help her come to some kind of healing. And in the essay, a little bit of what she talks about is how she realized that she needed to stop and take a step back from her life and help heal herself, which is, I can relate. I just talked about that earlier. So, and in terms of scholarly work, it's really approachable. It's not like a really dry, journal article that you're going to fall asleep reading. So,
and was published in the Journal of Loss and Trauma in 2009. So we'll have the title of that and links to that up in the show notes for everyone. Thank you. Okay, I am going to recommend that you check out Liz's pieces on Dear Adoption. So Liz wrote, Dear Adoption, let me tell you about the little girl inside of me. And there's 2 parts. And this is going to be a spoiler because it's the last line, but I'm going to read it anyway. One look in the mirror that shows me the woman I am, not in spite of you, Adoption, but because of you. And it's just a very thoughtful piece. And Liz is such a gifted writer, you guys. I mean, she works at it, I know for sure, because of your profession. But yeah, they're really beautiful, thoughtful, insightful pieces. And I will link to those. You got to check those out. The other thing I wanted to mention is a new organization that has formed very recently called Adoptees United. And Greg Luce and Shauna Hodgson are a couple of people that I had on the show very briefly, as Liz was a guest on this episode too, when we recapped the conference we were at earlier this spring. And so Greg and Shauna, Annette and Erica have started this organization called Adoptees United. And I think that you should go check this out, adopteesunited.org, and you can sign up for a newsletter to find out more details, what they're working on. But they are set up to build state level legislative work with partner organizations. They are going to work with intercountry adoptee organizations to assist to secure U.S. citizenship rights. And they want, I'm reading this from their website, we hope to become a trusted national voice and source of information and advocacy for issues impacting all adult adoptees in the United States. So even though I'm in Canada, I'm very excited about this new organization and really excited for those people that have started this up. I keep saying Greg and Shauna because they're the only ones I've met. But yeah, have you seen this, Liz? Adoptees United?
Yeah, I think I just saw a little something because we're all friends on Facebook, and I was like, oh, I need to look more at this. But I literally just finished submitting the draft of my dissertation proposal. So I've been a little inundated.
You have stuff going on for sure. Yeah, I will link to Adoptees United and their Facebook page in the show notes. And so I just want to make sure that you guys go and sign up for their newsletter so we can kind of keep in the loop about what's happening next. Anything for more adoptee advocacy, that's super on my radar. I'm sure you too. All right. Where can we connect with you online, Liz?
So right now I have, I'm working on getting a new website up, but currently there's a a blog, which you can find me at LizDeBetta.com. So really easy. But I'm hoping in the next couple of weeks for it to actually be like a nice, shiny new website so that it looks a little bit better.
Fancy. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And oh my goodness, I had some major takeaways from you. And so thank you. Thanks so much for your wisdom and insight.
Thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
I just want to say a giant thank you for hanging with me through this summer. We had some big stuff kind of happening behind the scenes, which I'm not really ready to share yet, but it was a challenging season for me. And I am so grateful because so many of you stepped up and signed up to support the show monthly, which is such a huge gift and that makes it possible for me to sustain these shows weekly. I wouldn't be able to do the show without you, truly. So thank you. If you want to be a partner of the show and share that you think Adoptees On is important and want it to continue and exist in this world, if you go to adopteeson.com/partner, there's details of how to sign up there. And there's bonuses for partnering with me monthly. There is a secret supporter-only podcast that's also weekly, which is really fun. And you got a taste of that in September. I released a few off-script episodes so you could kind of see what that's like. I also have a secret Facebook group for adoptees only, which is a really safe space. And the people there are just tremendous people. And when I have something I'm going through, I go in there and ask for advice. And you're just all so helpful. So those are some of the rewards for partnering monthly. If you want to make sure you don't never miss an episode, make sure you subscribe to the show. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, all kinds of places. It's on YouTube. I am so grateful to be back in your ears every single week. And thanks for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.